There is a particular kind of moment in geopolitics that most people miss entirely. Not the dramatic ones, the invasions, the declarations, the images of fire on television. Those are easy to see. The moments I mean are quieter. A fleet repositioning, a new base described as a logistics facility, an exercise that repeats itself year after year, each time slightly larger than the last. Those moments rarely make the front page, but they are the ones that actually rewrite the map. What is happening right now in and around the Strait of Hormuz is one of those moments. I want to be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not. I am not telling you a war is imminent. I am not predicting catastrophe. What I am telling you is that a structural shift in global naval power is unfolding in one of the most consequential waterways on Earth. And if you understand the geography, the data, and the 20-year pattern behind it, the picture is considerably more significant than most headlines suggest. So let's start at the beginning. The geography that makes everything else possible. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point, is roughly 21 miles wide. The navigable shipping channel itself is even tighter. 2 lanes, each about 2 miles across, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. That is the physical reality through which, in 2024 alone, approximately 20.7 million barrels of oil passed every single day. That figure comes from tracking firm Kepler. It represents roughly 31% of the world's entire seaborne oil supply. This is not a distant abstraction. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran, every barrel they export to global markets depends on that narrow passage. And in 2025, China imported approximately 11.55 million barrels of oil per day, record highs. Over 55% of that came from the Middle East. Around 40 to 50% of China's total seaborne oil imports pass through Hormuz. When you understand those numbers, you understand why Beijing has spent 2 decades quietly repositioning itself in this region. Not with speeches, with ships, with ports, with infrastructure investments that look like economics but function as strategic architecture. The exercise that is more than an exercise. Since 2019, China, Russia, and Iran have conducted annual joint naval drills called Maritime Security Belt. Each year, the exercises have grown in scope and complexity. The 2023 edition incorporated nighttime operations and drone integration. The 2024 edition introduced live fire components in the Gulf of Oman. By 2025, electronic warfare simulations were added, a direct acknowledgement that modern maritime competition extends deep into the electromagnetic spectrum. In February 2026, Maritime Security Belt 2026 was announced for the Strait of Hormuz itself. Russian destroyers, Chinese guided missile frigates, Iranian naval vessels, all operating together in the world's most strategically sensitive waterway. This announcement came at the exact moment the United States was repositioning 2 carrier strike groups toward the region. The USS Abraham Lincoln, redirected from the South China Sea, and the USS Gerald R. Ford, ordered from the Atlantic. 2 of the world's most powerful naval forces, converging on the same narrow waterway simultaneously. The official Chinese framing of their participation is always the same: anti-piracy operations, shipping lane protection, regional stability. That language is technically accurate. It is also strategically incomplete. Because you do not conduct live fire drills and electronic warfare simulations in a critical global choke point to deter pirates. You do it to signal capability, to normalize presence, to make yourself a permanent variable in every calculation your rivals run about that corridor. That is the real function of Maritime Security Belt. Not a drill, a statement. The fleet behind the statement. To appreciate the weight of that statement, you need to understand what China's Navy actually is in 2026. The People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan, now operates over 370 battle force ships and submarines, including 3 aircraft carriers. The Pentagon projects that number could reach 435 vessels by 2030. For comparison, the U.S. Navy currently operates around 296 battle force ships, with projections showing that number declining to approximately 294 by 2030 under current funding plans. China already has the world's largest navy by hull count. This is not a prediction, it is the present reality. What changed it from a regional coastal defense force into a global power projection navy is the industrial engine behind it. China's state-owned shipyards dominate global commercial shipbuilding production. They operate at a continuous high-volume construction rhythm that no other nation can currently match. While the United States struggles with delayed frigate programs, its first new-generation frigate is now targeted for 2028. China commissioned its first Type 054B stealth frigate in 2025 and began sea trials of the Type 076 amphibious assault ship, capable of launching aircraft via electromagnetic catapult. The specific vessels that matter for Hormuz are the Type 055 destroyers. These are not second-tier warships. They are cruiser-sized platforms carrying over 100 vertical launch cells for missiles, phased array radar systems, advanced electronic warfare suites, and layered air defense capabilities. In February 2025, China deployed a Type 055 destroyer, the Zunyi, alongside a frigate and a replenishment vessel to the Tasman Sea, thousands of miles from Chinese home waters, for live fire exercises. Australia and New Zealand had to divert commercial aircraft around the drill zones. That deployment was a proof of concept, a public demonstration that China can now sustain combat-capable naval operations in waters far from its shores. The Hormuz exercises are an application of the same concept, in a far more sensitive environment. The logistics of permanence. There is a detail in the composition of China's regional deployments that receives very little attention, but that defense analysts consider the most significant indicator of long-term intent. The replenishment vessels, long-range logistics ships, fleet oilers, supply vessels, combat support ships, are what transform a symbolic deployment into a sustained operational presence. Without them, warships must return to port regularly. With them, a navy can remain on station indefinitely, thousands of miles from its nearest base. China has been expanding its fleet auxiliary capabilities steadily. And critically, in 2017, China established its first overseas military base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, approximately 1,500 miles southwest of Hormuz. Beijing initially described it as a logistics facility for anti-piracy operations. It has since been expanded to accommodate PLAN aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy noted the irony directly. Those capabilities are unnecessary for combating piracy and were added well after the specter of that threat had receded. Djibouti sits at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the gateway between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Combined with Gwadar Port in Pakistan, a $50 billion belt and road investment that sits at the entrance to the Arabian Sea, China has constructed what strategic analysts call a forward logistics network along the maritime routes leading directly into the Persian Gulf. The pattern is deliberate. The flag follows trade. But in Beijing's case, the Atlantic Council observed, they sometimes arrive together. Planned port calls are consistently associated with expanding belt and road investment, new trade agreements, and maritime infrastructure development across Gulf states. This is not coincidence. This is a method. What Beijing actually wants. Here is where I want to spend some time because this is the part most commentary gets wrong. China does not need to defeat the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf to achieve its strategic objectives there. That is not the goal. Military confrontation between nuclear powers carries catastrophic risks that neither side wants. Beijing understands this perfectly. What China wants is considerably more sophisticated and considerably more achievable. China imports approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. In 2025, that amounted to roughly 1.38 million barrels per day, or about 13 to 14% of China's total crude oil imports. Beijing and Tehran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership in 2021, covering energy, infrastructure, and security cooperation. China also has deepening economic ties with Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. More than 55% of China's oil imports originate from this region. A Washington that has the power to threaten those supply lines through blockade, sanctions enforcement, or military pressure on Iranian infrastructure has leverage over Beijing that does not require firing a single shot. That leverage disappears the moment China has an active naval presence in the vicinity. Because then, every American action carries the additional risk of interaction, accidental or otherwise, with Chinese military assets. That is asymmetric deterrence. And it works before the first missile is ever launched. Consider the situation as it actually evolved in early 2026. When Iranian forces declared a blockade of the strait in March, Beijing found itself in a peculiar position. It was the largest buyer of Iranian oil. It had the deepest economic relationship with Iran, and yet it possessed no formal mechanism to protect its supply lines militarily without wading into a confrontation with the United States. China's leverage was economic, not naval, not yet. That experience is not lost on Chinese planners. The Gulf states are watching. There is another dimension to this that rarely gets the attention it deserves: the perceptions of the regional governments themselves. Saudi Arabia has been deepening economic and technological ties with Beijing for years. The UAE has expanded strategic partnerships with China across infrastructure, fintech, and energy. Qatar's state investment vehicles have committed hundreds of millions into Chinese firms. Multiple Gulf capitals are quietly exploring what a more multipolar security environment might look like, one where Washington is not the only source of guarantees. This is a profound shift from the assumptions that define the post-1991 order. For 4 decades, the Gulf monarchies operated under a simple calculation. American naval dominance in the Gulf meant that alignment with Washington was the safest long-term strategy. You didn't need to like it. You just needed to recognize that there was no alternative military architecture available. China is methodically dismantling that assumption. Not by offering itself as a replacement, Beijing is careful not to overextend its security commitments, but by making itself present enough, economically integrated enough, and militarily capable enough that regional governments begin to believe hedging is possible, that alternatives exist, that the unipolar era has an expiration date. Once that belief takes hold, alliance behavior starts changing, quietly at first, then faster. The numbers Washington doesn't want to say out loud. I want to return for a moment to the naval balance because the data tells a story that American strategic discourse tends to approach carefully. The U.S. Navy's battle force fleet has been declining for years. Under current funding trajectories, it is projected to shrink toward 294 ships by 2030, even as the PLAN approaches 435. The Pentagon's own 2025 annual report to Congress warned that China's accelerating construction is no longer merely narrowing a capability gap. It is beginning to create a structural, numerical imbalance Washington may struggle to reverse. The U.S. Navy recently made significant changes to its frigate program, targeting its first vessel for 2028. China commissioned a new generation stealth frigate in 2025. China began sea trials of an amphibious assault ship with electromagnetic catapults in 2025. The Pentagon projects China could operate 9 aircraft carriers by 2035. And here is the strategic bind that makes all of this harder. The United States is simultaneously maintaining commitments in the Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. That is not a critique of American policy. It is a structural observation about the cost of global primacy in an era of peer competition. Resources stretched across 3 simultaneous theaters against a competitor with the world's largest commercial shipbuilding industry, the world's largest navy by hull count, and a clear sense of strategic priorities. Time may actually favor Beijing's position. The longer China expands its naval reach incrementally without triggering direct conflict, the more normalized its global military presence becomes. And normalization is strategically powerful. It reshapes what other nations consider possible. It reshapes what alliances consider necessary. The pattern history recognizes. What we are watching in Hormuz follows a pattern that great powers have executed repeatedly throughout history. Economic expansion first, trade routes, investment, energy agreements. Then security commitments that follow those investments. Then rotational military deployments justified by those commitments. Then normalized presence. Then structural integration into the regional security architecture. The British Empire followed this trajectory in the 19th century. The United States followed it in the 20th. China is entering that same historical phase now, with the advantage of studying its predecessors closely. The Djibouti base was described as a logistics facility. It now accommodates aircraft carriers. The Maritime Security Belt drills began as counter-piracy exercises in 2019. They now include electronic warfare simulations and live-fire components in the world's most sensitive choke point. Chinese Belt and Road port investments span from Pakistan to East Africa to the Mediterranean. Each one, individually, appears to be an economic decision. Together, they constitute a forward basing network that no one formally declared and no one formally approved. This is how structural power shifts actually happen, not through announcements, through accumulation. The three paths forward. I want to be honest about the range of outcomes here because anyone who presents one scenario as inevitable is not doing serious analysis. The first possibility is managed coexistence. American and Chinese naval forces establish communication protocols, operate in overlapping theaters without direct confrontation, and Hormuz gradually becomes a multipolar security environment. Contested, uncomfortable, but stable. This has historical precedent. During the Cold War, US and Soviet forces operated in proximity across multiple regions for decades without direct conflict. It required discipline, clear communication channels, and a mutual recognition that miscalculation was not in either side's interest. The second possibility is prolonged strategic competition without open conflict. China deepens its regional presence. The United States reinforces alliances and adapts its deployment posture. Both sides probe each other's resolve across multiple theaters simultaneously: the South China Sea, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf. Tension becomes chronic but managed. This is the scenario most analysts currently consider most likely. The third possibility is the one that keeps serious people awake at night. A future crisis involving Iran, or any other actor in the region, spirals beyond its intended scope. A radar misidentification. A communication failure between naval assets from different countries operating in the same narrow waterway. A commander on one side misreading the intentions of a commander on the other. History is full of conflicts that originated in moments nobody planned for. The more actors operating heavily armed platforms in confined strategic spaces, the smaller the margin for error becomes. Not zero, but smaller. I do not present this as prediction. I present it as the honest acknowledgement of what elevated complexity in contested environments actually means. The deeper question. Here is what I think matters most. The unipolar era, the period between the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 and approximately now, was not, as it sometimes gets portrayed, a period of American dominance by design alone. It was also a period in which no other power had the industrial capacity, the naval reach, or the strategic willingness to contest American primacy in critical maritime spaces. That period is ending, not because America has become weak, but because China has become genuinely capable of sustained blue water naval operations, of long-range logistics, of incremental force projection across multiple regions simultaneously. What replaces unipolarity is not yet clear. The scholars who study power transitions describe this phase as inherently dangerous, not because the rising power necessarily wants conflict, but because the transitions themselves generate miscalculation risks that neither side fully controls. The existing power resists adjustment. The rising power tests limits. And somewhere in that friction, the probability of inadvertent escalation rises. The ships in Hormuz right now are carrying more than their weapons and their crews. They are carrying that friction. They are carrying the weight of a world that is reorganizing itself around a competition that neither side entirely chose, and neither side knows precisely how to manage. The question worth asking is not whether Washington and Beijing can coexist in the same strategic waterways. They will have to. The more important question is whether both governments have the institutional discipline, the communication architecture, and the strategic patience to navigate that coexistence without stumbling into something neither intended. That answer is not yet written. It is being written now, in real time, by the choices being made in naval operations centers and policy rooms on both sides of the Pacific. What we watch in Hormuz is not just a regional naval story. It is a preview of how the world's two most powerful countries will manage, or mismanage, the most consequential power transition of the 21st century. Pay attention to it.